Here we are, week 2, looking at chapter 2, and this is going to be a part 1 video, looking at a little bit about history of Canadian families and also looking at the cultural flavor of Canada back in the past a wee bit, and then introduce you to some of the sort of diversity issues and immigration issues that relates to Canada and their families. And so it's important to bear in mind, not just in terms of the diversity, in terms of backgrounds of ethnicity or race, but also to consider the variations of family form, of how that changed over time. We've moved from being in a very specific sort of nuclear family, mom and dad and kids living and then not going through any divorces, going through to entirely divorce, introduced in 1982, 68, and then in 82 making the adjustment for easier divorces. And then we look at the degree of single-parented families by women, this growing population of single-parented families by men. And then we also consider blended families, and we consider adopted families, we consider same-sex families. Look at all the variation, and then including how might families be started by in vitro or other reproductive technologies, surrogates. So we have this sort of shaping of families in Canada that have been not just by the uniquenesses and differences of immigration and the diverse population of Canada, but of also some of the other individual family choices that we have. So let's get on with part 1, and we're going to look at the beginning part of this chapter, and then part 2 we'll be looking at more of the experience of the immigrant family in Canada. Okay, we'll start this by having keep in the background this reflective question. Thinking about your own family, what is your ethnic or cultural background? In what ways would you say that your family is similar to or different from most other Canadian families? We all have a little bit of background, and it's not all just being in Canada. You know, my parents lived in Canada, were born and raised in Canada, but their parents are from Scotland and Ireland and England area. And so we may have a more Anglo-Saxon background, but we may also have other flavors a part of our family background. And some of us might even be more recent immigrants than others of us. So just sort of reflect on that when we go through this particular, this chapter. When we think of the two sort of definitions that stand out when it comes to differences, when it comes to cultural differences, is race and ethnicity. Race is a system of classifying people based on physical characteristics such as skin color. Whereas ethnicity, it's a term used to specify a group of people who share a common cultural background or heritage. Now, while cultures are more real than races, classification by ethnicity is still a very complex undertaking, especially in a multicultural society like Canada. Interpreting census data on ethnicity is challenging for several reasons. Now, census is what we do I think it's every 4 or 5 years we take a census. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the previous videos, the census form used to be a long form, and then it was shortened, and now it's come back to a long form. The long form has a lot more data that allows us to make a lot more decisions, or at least understandings, about the Canadian culture, flavor, and demographic, where shorter form gathers less data. And so this interpreting of the census data is challenging because the concept of ethnicity is fluid. Many people would describe themselves as Canadian, even though that they have immigration background. Like I said, Anglo-Saxon, English, British background. It still means there's a sort of a flavor that comes from another part of the world, if you will. And so ethnicity tends to be fluid. People could alter how they feel about themselves. They may adapt. There was a period of time my father-in-law, Italian, would describe himself as Italian-Canadian. And much later in his life, he described himself as Canadian-Italian and then more Canadian. And so there's a fluidity about ethnicity. Respondents understand their ethnicity, generational cohort, and length of time since immigration and social context and time of date of collection affecting reporting from one census to the next. So essentially, things change. The cohort, what that means is, for example, when you graduated from high school, everybody else who graduated at the same time as you did are called your cohort. This is your category of people who have a similar experience together. It's called a cohort. So these generational cohorts would be people who are of the same generation. And so their understanding of their own ethnicity, you know, that if, for example, my parents came from some other part of the world and had lived all their lives in that part of the world and come here and then have children, and I was one of those children but born in Canada, then my generational experience about my ethnicity might be different than my parents, because I'm being raised in a different culture. The friends that I would associate with are different. So my understanding of my culture might be different than my parents, and that might also be part of the challenge. Increasing intermarriage among various groups increases reporting of multiple ancestries. And so that's become more common. When more people rub shoulders with one another of different backgrounds, then there's the potential that some of those people will fall in love and marry and have children. And of course, variations of diversity emerge from there. And then lastly, changes in format of census questions took effect. Now, for example, the census historically didn't include, if you were to pick your ethnicity, to include Canadian, but that was included in 2006. And so it became an ethnic choice, and it led to an increase in this category. More people would identify themselves as Canadian. Now, another term that would be included is that of visible minority. And this is a person other than Aboriginal who is non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. And so in Canada, that can include a variety of different groups of people under visible minority. The people from Chinese background, South Asian, Black, Arab, West Asian, Filipino, all of which would have different experiences and different ways of identifying a person, both by skin color or some other identifying characteristics. So that would make them a visible minority. In 1996 census, for the first time, people were asked whether they were a member of one population group defined as a visible minority. Just as we've seen the definition of family in Chapter 1, there are many different ways to describe groups of people. And those keep changing over time. That's that fluidity component. Legal definitions may differ from social definitions. Individuals may have their own personal definition for their race and ethnic identity. Now, minority groups, these refer to groups that hold less power than the dominant group. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean numbers. A minority group may be more in number, but less in power. Okay, that's a distinction that's important to be able to make. Now, when we move on to the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, Aboriginal, or a person who is First Nations, is an Aboriginal is a person who is First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. These three groups. Aboriginal families consist of parents and children living together in a household, and may also include extended family networks. And so this is a different family form. It's not to say that Aboriginal people are the only people who have this larger sort of connected family. Other cultures and other groups of people share that experience, but it is part of the cultural norm for many people of Aboriginal backgrounds. From the first Aboriginal people who arrived thousands of years ago, the area that is now Canada has been populated by waves of immigrants. The social structure, the cultural norms, the values have changed with each passing wave. And we'll see a little bit more of that at the end of this particular presentation. Now, Aboriginal population is growing nearly 6 times faster than the Canadian population as a whole, especially the Métis, largely because of a young population. More of the people of Aboriginal descent are a childbearing age, and makes it more likely to have children, and therefore are growing at a greater rate. That and more people are identifying as Aboriginal. Now, a little bit of background, history, if you will. A lot of the background and history of Canada as it relates to families, and as to Canada and immigration, has been the character of English-Canadian society has roots in Britain. Canada became part of the British Empire as a result of conquest and colonization. Early English immigrants sought out individual fortunes and were members of the Protestant sect. Now, they brought the Protestant religion to Canada, and the chief responsibility in this particular sect was the nuclear family membership. You know, mom and dad, division of labor, children were born. They were less encouraging of community-wide cooperation, contrary to the cultural and religious practices of Roman Catholics in Quebec and Aboriginals. Now, if we move a wee bit more over to Quebec, though, Quebec government encouraged a society that mirrored France and discouraged dissonance. Roman Catholic Church defined family and educational goals to include living more in a rural life, which was really central to their belief. Large families were ideal, and the underpinning of French language or culture. And if you paid attention, you know, over some of the history of Canada, Quebec has always hung close to their culture of language and French language and culture. Only the importance of French language remains unchanged in Quebec. The rural lifestyles, not so much. The large families, not so much. But it's made central only to Quebec society rather than French-Canadian culture as a whole. From 1960 on, the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was replaced by education, by the industrial economy, and replaced rural large families, which was curtailed by the sexual revolution and contraceptive advancements. The provincial government took over the social services, and Quebec family support programs have become the strongest in Canada. So as much as we have a sort of a similarity across Canada and provinces, each province does have an opportunity to develop their own programs, and of which Quebec has been strong in family services. Now, if we could look at other immigrant groups as it relates to the Canadian population, diversity of Canada population continues to increase significantly over the decades. From 2006 survey, they counted 200 plus ethnic groups. Now, there was 206 countries in the world, and 200 ethnic groups are represented in Canada. By the year 2031, it's estimated that 25% will be foreign-born, and about half of those 25% will be Asian-based. And about another 30% will belong to a visible minority group, nearly doubling the proportion that was reported in 2006. A vast majority of visible minorities will live in cities, making up 63% of Toronto, 59% of Montreal, and 31% of Vancouver. And nearly half of those will be 15 years or older, will be foreign-born, and have at least one foreign-born parent. So we have our movement towards greater diversity. Now, when we think back in history, pre-1900, many newcomers were from Britain and the United States. And for many years after, the federal and provincial governments deterred immigration of non-white members of certain religious groups. Many groups also admitted to Canada for humanitarian reasons. Following World War II and before 1967, immigration favored immigrants of European or European heritage countries. And so as much as we might look today and seeing immigration being of different cultures and ethnicities, it's always been a very big part of Canadian history. It's been which part of the world has immigration been a part. It's impossible to talk about immigrants as a single group. Many factors have affected who was allowed to immigrate and where and how many could come in a particular period and what their experience was like upon arrival. Over the last century, key factors have included the desire to maintain a British character in Canada, the need for labor to develop the country, and humanitarian motives. However, the desire to keep Canada British conflicted with the need for labor. For example, we had issues for mining in the past, lumber, railway construction. This is all at the turn of the 20th century. And in boom times, both employers and the federal government supported an influx of workers. But during the recession and the Great Depression, immigration was always discouraged. Humanitarian reasons, fugitive slaves who escaped from the U.S. came to Canada once slavery was banned in 1793 and abolished in 1834. So if we look at this chart of multiracial families, there's an increased number of Canadians who report to be more than one ethnic group. And what you're seeing here, this is in 2011, ethnic origins, and you see the numbers, total responses, those that have single response in terms of single response of ethnicity, and those that have multiple ethnic backgrounds. We see an increase in mixed-race families, marriage and common law unions between visible and non-visible minority individuals, children born to such parents, children adopted internationally or transracially in Canada, mixed-race couples experiencing difficulty arise from different cultural traditions or from prejudice of relatives. We see such a variation, and this is from the origins of Canadians of the census that came out as data in 2011. Now this particular chart, this is looking at how it's changed from 1981 to the order of the top 10 countries of birth of recent immigrants in 2011 and 1981. And nearly 3/4 of immigrants come from Africa, Asia, Caribbean, and Latin America. And only 16% from Europe. Currently, the largest group of recent immigrants is Chinese. This is from the 2006 census. South Asians were the largest visible minority group from that census as well. Now, when people come from other countries, they have access, or they sort of view Canada as the promised land and have access to the Citizenship and Immigration Canada to get support as to how to make the transition. There's all sorts of policies in place at the time of arrival, either to facilitate or, in some cases, complicate adaptation. In the past, some of this complication was people who would take on the role as somewhat of a, I'll help you make the transition, but all they would really do would be take money and really not help people too much. And then we have concerns about what kinds of support are being brought forward and help. Usually they're around language and around getting employment and the likes. And now with more recent immigration, people start to get concerned about things that we'll talk about in the second section around stigma and around the potential for discrimination. Despite generally being more highly educated and skilled, new immigrants have difficulty finding work. Largely it's the lack of the Canadian experience, and it's been interesting that a lot of work has been done looking at what's been the part that interferes with immigrants finding work in Canada. And the Canadian experience is not the same as it's not universal as far as how you find a job and how you find work. And so there's problems in having qualifications recognized. And so there's been attempts to try to, well, what are the differences between the graduating requirements in one country, that with Canada, and what is the makeup that needs to be done or the improvement that needs to be done? And is there a relationship between the two that, enable people with immigrant backgrounds to find reasonable employment? It used to be somewhat of a joke to sort of say that if you ever have a heart attack in Toronto, where would you want to be? Well, in a cab, because a number of people who are in a cab driving who are immigrants who are also very well educated, including being doctors. And one of the other difficulties has been the fluency of English or French. And so the graphic you see is the webpage for Citizenship and Immigration in Canada, and it's a study guide to help get better acquainted with Canadian culture and Canadian language. And then lastly, we can look at this chart here, which is the average hourly wage distribution of employees aged 25 to 54, immigrants and Canadian born, looking at the differences in pay. And this is 2008. Now, some of the data, including the assignment you have, is older data, and it's partly because it had more complete data. It was long form gathered information, and now the material from the last almost 10 years has been short form, and it's really affected the data. So on average, incomes are lower for immigrants than for Canadian-born workers. And you can see generally at all levels it's that way. And in 2008, the average hourly wage of a working age Canadian-born employee was $23.72. This is in 2008, remember. While the average hourly wage of a Canadian immigrant employee was $21.44. The gap was $2.28 per hour. And over the course of the year, that becomes rather significant for having the same work and maybe the same education. The disadvantage, both in finding work and the level of income, may continue for many years to come until a lot of these hurdles, there are solutions found to combat them. Okay, this has been part 1. I hope you find it useful. Please find part 2 in week 2 folder as well. Thank you very much. Bye now.